Hey guys, welcome to today's class on homeostasis and the endocrine and urinary systems. Today we're going to focus on the endocrine systems, which I'll talk about at length, obviously, in a few minutes. And in our next class, we'll talk about the urinary systems. Now, I don't know how much you know about the endocrine system, but most of you have some familiarity with the urinary system since it's involved with the production of urine, which we're all obviously familiar with. But although these two systems may seem, at least initially, a little bit unrelated, they in fact are related. In fact, the endocrine system helps to control the urinary system, and both of these systems work to maintain what's called homeostasis. And obviously, we'll talk a lot more about this in a couple of minutes, but I will broadly define homeostasis now and specifically define it in a few minutes. Just so that I can provide some context so you understand what's going on with these two systems. And now the word homeostasis, the etymology of this word is within, and stasis means unchanging. So the homeostasis then is reference to the fact that we as humans, in fact, pretty much all animals, have a set of conditions internally which operate or stay within a fairly narrow range. And these ranges of conditions should be relatively unchanging in order for the organism to function properly. A quick example for us would be body temperature. We all have an internal body temperature. There's the homeo part. And we all know that that average body temperature is about 98.6. And it shouldn't change very much, maybe within a degree or so over the course of a day. And in fact, that's not an accident that our body temperature stays within that narrow range. That is in fact homeostasis, and that internal body conditions are regulated or monitored and controlled by this system called the endocrine system. Now the endocrine system, the etymology of this word would be endo, again meaning within or inside, and then the crine part, the chronology or crine, refers to, or it comes from the Greek word to sift or sort. And what we're actually sifting and sorting inside the body is a series of secretions produced by the tissues and organs of the endocrine system called hormones. Now, we're all familiar with hormones, but their relationship to the endocrine system is that they are substances, either proteins or lipids, produced by cells, tissues, and glands of the endocrine system. They're released into the bloodstream, and then these substances go and invoke a change or induce a change somewhere else in the body. And so we have, for example, some hormones which help to regulate our body temperature. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but our nervous systems can also help them to regulate our body temperature. But nevertheless, the endocrine system is a disparate series of glands that are spread throughout the body that help to maintain homeostasis. Our urinary systems, of course, produce urine. Its relationship to homeostasis may not be immediately intuitive, but urine is actually made up of a number of things, but primarily the waste product in urine is urea. That's spelled U-R-E-A. And urea is a form of ammonia which has been converted in the liver, so it can be excreted. So it's a waste product. And it actually comes from the fact that when you digest proteins, specifically breaking down the amino acids, there's an NH2 group which is broken off and becomes an NH3 group. That NH3, of course, is ammonia. And so anytime you digest protein, you're constantly producing this waste product, which has to be detoxified and excreted from the body. Now, that could be argued that that's important to homeostasis. You obviously wouldn't want ammonia or urea to accumulate in the body. That could obviously throw us out of balance. But the other thing that the urinary system does to help maintain homeostasis is to maintain internal levels of water, the water content in our blood and blood plasma. And that's, of course, important to regulate, because if it becomes too watery or too salty or there's less water, that can affect osmosis in the cells of our body. And so we need to keep our osmotic levels within a fairly narrow range as well. And again, intuitively, we all know if we drink a whole lot of water, that we urinate a lot more. And so our urinary system then is responding to the fact that you just drank, 6 Aquafina bottles of water. You've diluted your blood a little bit, or certainly the blood plasma is a lot more watery. So the kidneys help to, which are constantly filtering the blood, will actually pass more water out into those collecting ducts, and then you'll urinate more. So again, we'll talk about the urinary systems later and how it actually functions. Today we're going to focus on homeostasis and the endocrine systems. So the specific definition of homeostasis is the maintenance of steady internal conditions despite fluctuations in an external environment. That's kind of a nice textbooky definition of homeostasis. If you want to think of it in simpler terms, again, we have, for a whole lot of things in our body, some conditions or a range of conditions that have to be kept in a fairly narrow set of preset conditions. And we are constantly potentially inducing or exposing our bodies to things that could bring us out of homeostasis. So again, the example I just used is the water content in our blood and blood plasma. If we drink a lot of water, or if we go without drinking water for a long period of time, we're potentially changing the water content, which then may need to be regulated by organs like the kidneys. Our temperature, our body temperature, is another example. Everybody knows that our homeostatic range of values for our body temperature is around 98.6 Fahrenheit. There's your homeostasis part. The homeo is the internal conditions. In this case, the body temperature has to be kept at 98.6, and that's the stasis part. Now, that said, we are constantly potentially moving our bodies out of that normal range. You walk outside and it's a cold day and you're just wearing a t-shirt, you're potentially dropping your core body temperature. Certainly if you jump into a cold swimming pool, even if I suppose you drink a cup of hot coffee or drink an icy drink, we could potentially again be moving those internal conditions away from their preset levels. And so we have to have a series of glands and organs that help to return us back to that normal homeostatic preset level. So why is it necessary? Again, without going into a whole lot of detail here, we know from earlier in this year that there are conditions in the body that are responsive to changes in things like pH or temperature or even water levels. So we know, for example, we could potentially change the structure of proteins if we elevate our body temperature too much. We know that enzymes operate within a fairly narrow range of conditions. And if we change things like the pH of our blood, that can affect enzyme action. We certainly know our cells need to operate within a fairly narrow range. Otherwise, they can either swell up and burst or shrivel up and die. We know our cells need a steady supply of fuels and nutrients, and so on and so forth. So without getting into all the things that have to be regulated by the body, you can certainly get a sense of why it's important that our bodies operate within a narrow range. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we actually have other systems which, like the excretory system, like the urinary system, that operate to keep our body within that fairly narrow range of conditions. One that may not be immediately obvious to you is our nervous systems. So our nervous systems are comprised of cells which help to collect information about the environment around us, relay it to our brains, where our brains can interpret it, and then evoke some kind of response. And I'll explain the difference between the nervous and endocrine system responses in a couple of minutes. But just know that there are lots of organs, even in other organ systems, who may contribute to the maintenance of homeostasis. Now, the endocrine system, because that's what we're focusing on today, is comprised of a series of tissues organized into organs called glands. And these glands are producing substances, again, either protein or lipid, which are released by those cells typically into the bloodstream, where they can circulate around the body to induce some sort of change in the body. The substances that they release are called hormones. Hormones are just chemical messengers. And so the glands then that are in the endocrine system produce these substances, release them into the blood. They travel all over the body, finding their target cells. And when they find them, they induce a change in the cells and in the tissues and then in the body. Again, we probably will just look at a couple of specific examples of this, and I've already mentioned these, but here are some examples of homeostasis. Thermoregulation, we need to keep our body temperatures fairly constant. Osmoregulation, we have to control the amount of water that we intake and excrete. And then, of course, the disposal and excretion of nitrogen-containing wastes. We've already mentioned those. So let's take a look at the endocrine system today, because that's the one that's primarily involved with maintenance of homeostasis. There's a really good YouTube video on this. It's linked here if you wanted to take a look at it, in addition to the class that I'm teaching today. But let's jump in with the endocrine system. So again, it's maybe sounding a little bit redundant here, but the endocrine system consists of all hormone secreting cells. Now, the reason I'm actually sort of adding this slide to the deck of slides when I've already mentioned this is that I wanted to point out that there are some cells in our body which are not specifically organized into glands, which still release hormones. And so, for example, the pancreas, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is primarily a digestive organ, but it's also part of the endocrine system by releasing insulin, which helps to regulate our blood glucose levels. That's homeostasis. So although we have specific clusters of cells that form glands, which are exclusively part of the endocrine system, there are other glandular type cells that are found in other organs, like our testes and ovaries or our pancreases. And again, they work together with the nervous system. The nervous system actually is important because even if the nervous system doesn't directly induce a change to maintain homeostasis, it's involved with collecting information about all of those things that we have to keep in fairly narrow ranges of conditions. In other words, we have a part of our brain that's constantly regulating or monitoring, rather, our body temperature, our water content, our blood glucose levels. So the nervous system then is the part of the brain or part of the body which is monitoring the internal conditions and then may direct glands in the endocrine system to make a change. So let's take a look at the two different systems very quickly. We're not going to spend much time on the nervous system. Again, the focus of today is the endocrine, but the nervous system and endocrine system can work together to induce changes. The primary difference is how quickly they act. Nervous system responses to bring us back to homeostasis are typically very quick. Endocrine systems and their responses may be much slower, but both of them can work hand in hand to maintain homeostasis. And to give an example of this, I'm going to choose yours and my favorite Disney character, Elsa, who is, for some reason, standing out in the cold, shivering. She has been exposed to sub-zero temperatures, and her core body temperature has dropped from a comfortable, balmy 98.6 down to a chilly willy 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So the first thing that's going to happen is the nervous system. Actually, I've sort of switched characters here, and here's Pinkie Pie, because I didn't have an X-ray view of Elsa, but Pinkie Pie, regardless, it's going to work the same way, has a series of cells in the brain which can detect changes in the core body temperature. So in this case, Pinkie Pie has also stood out in the icy freezing cold. Her body temperature has dropped down to about 95. There's a region of the brain which detects this, And it's going to induce two changes, two systems to help bring Pinkie Pie's body up to whatever um, the normal body temperature is for that species. So the first is it's going to induce a nervous system response. And the nervous system acts again very, very quickly. So the brain detects the change and it may then regulate, it may send relay information to another part of the brain. That part of the brain then sends information down nerves throughout the entire body, which interact with muscles. And these nervous signals may cause the nerves to rapidly contract and relax, and so on. And by doing this, by contracting, relaxing, as you do that with your muscles, you will actually start to generate some body heat. So this response, this nervous system response, we know as shivering. And anybody who, for example, has jumped into a cold swimming pool and then got back up onto the deck of the pool and it's really cold outside, your body may immediately start to involuntarily shiver. It's not something we can control ourselves. It's outside of our conscious ability to regulate shivering. We can't induce it ourselves. We can't think right now that we're going to start shivering. So this is definitely a nervous system response to help quickly generate heat to bring the body temperature back up. It's slow. Sorry, it's fast. Its response is fairly fast, but it's not as effective as if we were to use our metabolic rate to increase body temperature. Now, metabolism, the sum of all of the metabolic processes happening in the cells of our body, can be changed. We can raise and lower our metabolic rate. And if we raise our metabolic rate and increase the amount of glucose, which is being converted to ATP in our mitochondria, that can also elevate our body temperature. But that process is relatively slow, and that process is endocrine. So again, the endocrine system tends to work more slowly. Our body temperature is low, so our brain detects it and signals some glands to release hormones. These hormones travel through the bloodstream until they find their target cells, and then they cause the target cells to induce some sort of a change, which can do things like increase our growth and metabolic rates. But the key here is it uses glands, not nerves, to do this, and that the changes that happen are much slower. So the nervous system, the shivering, can happen within seconds. The change in our metabolic rate can take minutes or hours before we really start to increase the metabolic rate, so it substantively changes our body temperature. Now, here are the glands that are part of the endocrine system. By the end of today, you should be familiar with several of these. So for example, we're going to talk a little bit about the hypothalamus, which is actually a region of the brain that is more of a nervous system structure than it is an endocrine, although it does also release hormones. Below the hypothalamus is a little nubby thing hanging off the base of our brain called the pituitary gland. This is a really important gland. It's actually called the master gland because it secretes a whole lot of hormones which affect other glands in the body or tissues. We won't talk a lot about the adrenal glands. These are the glands above the kidneys that release adrenaline in response to a scary situation. And adrenaline does a whole lot of things like elevate our respiration rate and slows down our digestion, increases our heart rate. But we won't talk a lot about this one. We talked a lot about the pancreas and digestion. When we talk in a few minutes about changes in blood sugar, we'll come back to the pancreas because it's also part of the endocrine system. We're going to save the testes and ovaries for our unit on reproduction, but obviously they are part of two organ systems. They are part of the reproductive system, for example, producing sex cells, but they're also technically part of the endocrine system because they produce hormones like estrogen and testosterone. We won't really talk at all about parathyroids. These are little nubs in behind these glands in our throat, thyroid glands, which we will talk about in a few minutes. And I think those are the majority of glands Again, the ones you should probably know something about: hypothalamus, the pituitary, the pancreas, and the thyroids, and later the testes and ovaries. So let's quickly take a look at how the endocrine system helps to counteract change. It does this by inducing or generating what's called a negative feedback loop. And some of you who are programmers know what feedback loops are, but essentially a feedback loop is, an example would be your thermostat in your house. Thermostat of your house can constantly monitor the temperature of your house. If it gets too warm, the air conditioning will kick in and it will bring the temperature of the house back down. It counteracts that increase in temperature. If the temperature of the house drops too much, we induce a change which brings the temperature back up by turning on the furnace until we get back to that normal preset level. So negative feedback loops are the majority of systems in our body which maintain homeostasis do this by these negative feedback loops. Here's quickly the example of negative feedback loops with respect to blood glucose levels. So let's say you eat something, even a burger, I suppose, does contain starch and sugar, which can cause the levels of glucose in our blood to go up. So we need to bring the levels of glucose back down to their normal levels. So we have a number of cells in the pancreas, which then produce and release insulin. Insulin causes the liver to take up glucose, and it also causes the cells in our body to use the glucose more directly. And so these two things together help to reduce the levels of glucose in the blood. Again, the negative feedback loop part is we'll continue to release this hormone until the level of glucose gets down to its normal preset levels. So maybe an hour or so after you finished eating, your blood glucose levels may have returned back to normal. This is detected by the cells in the pancreas, and they shut off and stop producing and releasing insulin. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but sometimes we may actually have a positive feedback loop which serves to increase levels of change. So an example of this is childbirth, but we'll get to this in a second. Imagine, for example, our body temperature is supposed to be 98.6. We do something which causes the body temperature to move up to 100 and then 101. A positive feedback loop would actually continue to move the body temperature higher and higher and higher. Now, normally we wouldn't want that. Normally we want a negative feedback loop to bring us back into our normal levels of body temperature. So as a result, the majority of glands in our body are negative feedback loops. And there's only a few instances where we actually want to move further away from our normal preset levels. The reason I'm not going to spend much time on this is because there's only a few instances of this, and it's probably better to think mostly about negative feedback when you think about our endocrine system. But here's a quick example of positive feedback loop. If you imagine a woman who's about to give birth, at some point the baby gets large enough that stretch receptors in the uterus cause the body to release a hormone called oxytocin, and this may cause uterine muscles to contract. In other words, she's ready to give birth. The brain is saying, let's release a hormone which will cause the uterine muscles around the baby to contract, which then push the baby out of the birth canal. And interestingly, instead of the oxytocin levels going back down after the first uterine contraction, the uterine contraction actually causes the release of more oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions. This causes the release of even more oxytocin, which causes even more muscle contractions in the uterus. And if you've ever seen movies of women in childbirth, you know that the labor pains, that's what they actually are, is uterine contractions. The labor pains get bigger and stronger and intensify the more and more a baby is closer to being born. And the stimulus to stop all of this and come back to our normal levels is in fact the birth of the child itself. Then the stretch receptors detect that there's no more baby there. They stop causing the release of oxytocin, which then causes the uterus to stop. Last few things about hormones. Like we've already mentioned that they're produced by endocrine glands, they're carried in the blood, and they induce some change on a target cell. So here's our endocrine cell, the secretory vesicles with their hormones released into the blood, travels through the blood, and then binds to some sort of target cell and causes a change. But there are actually two different classes of hormones that have two different effects on cells, and we classify these as either steroid or non-steroid hormones. Unfortunately, when we think about steroids, we often think about the abuse of steroids, which can be used by people like bodybuilders or professional athletes or semi-professional athletes in order to increase things like body mass and muscle mass. Certainly there are steroid hormones which can do this, but we don't, biologists don't think about steroid hormones as to whether or not they cause you to get more muscular or not. They think about steroid versus non-steroid in terms of how they act. So let's quickly take a look at the two different categories of hormones. The first what we'll talk about are the steroid hormones. And these hormones are, their way of acting is to physically enter the cell. And obviously, you could probably guess that non-steroid hormones don't enter the cell. Now, there's a reason for why and how they can enter the cell. Steroid hormones are lipids. Therefore, they are able to pass through the lipid bilayer of cells. So let's imagine up here in the corner, there's a gland like our testes or ovaries, and they produce a hormone like testosterone or estrogen. This is released, it travels through the bloodstream, and when it finally finds its target cell, one of those hormones will actually, instead of staying on the outside, will slip right through or pass through the lipid bilayer into the cell. Then they generally bind with a receptor in the cell, and this complex of molecules actually then slips through the nuclear envelope and then binds to the DNA and directly regulates the production of a protein. In other words, they activate a gene to do something in the cell. Now, again, the reason that steroid hormones can slip through the cell membrane is because they're lipids, and the cell membrane is lipid, and so like dissolves like, and so the steroid hormone is able to pass directly through and directly start to activate the cell to produce a particular protein. Last but not least, there are non-steroid hormones. Again, these things don't and can't enter the cell. So the changes that they invoke or induce happen by binding to a receptor on the membrane of the cell. Now, a non-steroid hormone is a protein. Proteins can't pass through a lipid. They're actually charged, and then remember, so they're polar, or certainly parts of them are polar, and then we have the non-polar lipid bilayer, so they can't pass through it. They're too large, and they're polar, trying to pass through a non-polar lipid bilayer. So what they do instead is they find their cells using the receptors, they bind to the receptor, which perhaps changes the shape of this receptor, which then causes something called a trophic cascade. It basically causes a whole lot of changes in the cell, ultimately causing the activation of enzymes inside the cell. So we have inactive enzymes. They need to be activated by certain chemicals or proteins. Those proteins are only activated if the receptors on the cell are activated, and those are only activated if there's the protein hormone present. So again, they can't and don't pass through the cell. They actually induce their changes from the outside. There's one specific example that I'd like you to be familiar with, and we're almost in the home stretch. Well, we are in the home stretch. We're almost done. I pinky promise. And the one example I would like you to be familiar with in terms of homeostasis is the regulation of body temperature. And it's going to look crazy complicated with a lot of text in a second. So let me just quickly give you an overview of what's happening here. What we're trying to regulate here, again, is a change in body temperature that's occurred. And in order to do that, we need to ultimately increase our metabolic rate. Now, our metabolic rate in our body will increase if we release the hormone thyroxine. Thyroxine is produced in the thyroid. These are a pair of glands in our throats. The thyroids produce thyroxine. Thyroxine increases body temperature and ultimately will warm the body up. Now, thyroxine is only going to produce, the thyroid's only going to produce thyroxine if the pituitary tells it to. Well, the pituitary isn't going to release its hormone unless the hypothalamus tells it to. So it looks kind of crazy complicated, but follow my logic here. We need to elevate our metabolic rate as part of our feedback loop to bring our body back into homeostasis, back up to 98.6. Our metabolic rate will only increase if thyroxine is released by the thyroid. Thyroid will not release thyroxine unless the pituitary releases its hormone to tell the thyroid to release its hormone. And the pituitary is not going to do that randomly. It's only going to do that if the hypothalamus tells it to. And the hypothalamus, remember, is a part of the brain that's constantly monitoring levels of conditions in the body. There actually are cells that can detect temperature. And if you get too cold, the hypothalamus detects it. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary to tell the thyroid to release its thyroxine. Thyroxine, as long as you're releasing it, will cause the metabolic rate of your body to increase, eventually raising the body temperature back up to 98.6. Once we get back to that level, the hypothalamus detects that. It tells the pituitary to stop. Pituitary tells the thyroid to stop. Thyroxine is no longer released, and metabolic rate goes back down to normal. That's the overview. Here are the specifics. Again, the first thing that happens is our body becomes too cold, so thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect this. The hypothalamus responds to this by secreting a hormone called TRH. TRH stands for TSH releasing hormone. That's the T, the TSH, releasing hormone. That TRH travels just an inch or two down to the pituitary gland below it. The pituitary gland releases TSH. Now, TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, I know there's a lot of acronyms here, but see if this makes sense. TRH is produced by the hypothalamus. It's a hormone which is causing the release of TSH. TSH is a hormone which we want to use to stimulate the thyroid. So the TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, we're only going to stimulate the thyroid if the hypothalamus tells us to. Once we do that, the thyroid stimulating hormone travels to the thyroids. The thyroids then release their thyroxine. This increases the metabolic rate in the cell's activities. This will cause the body temperature to gradually creep up until we reach, again, 98.6. Once that happens, the hypothalamus stops releasing its hormone, TRH. The TRH then is no longer reaching the pituitary, so there's nothing there telling it to release its TSH. If the pituitary is no longer releasing its TSH, there's nothing telling the thyroid to release its thyroxine. Without thyroxine, the body's metabolism or metabolic rate returns back to normal. This is one example, I think, of a feedback loop that you should be fairly comfortable and familiar with as a very specific and I think elegant example of how the endocrine system works. I know there's a lot of acronyms here. I know there's a lot of structures. In fact, there's 3 structures and 3 hormones, but you should be relatively familiar with this and you should be able to reconstruct this basic feedback loop certainly for the purposes of the test. That's it for the endocrine system for today. Next class, we're going to take a look at the urinary systems. Again, I know this was a long class, and I thank you for hanging in there till the bitter end. But next class, it'll get even more interesting when we start talking about the kidneys. Without kidneys, you're in trouble. All right, there's my lame pun for the day. That's it. Have a great day. Let me know if you have any questions, as always, and thank you.